Copyright disclaimer. Under Title 17 U.S.C. Section 107, allowance is made for fair use for purposes such as criticism, comment, news reporting, teaching, scholarship, and research. Fair use is permitted by copyright statute that might otherwise be infringing. Nonprofit, educational, or personal use tips the balance in favor of fair use. Okay, guys, so I found this article on Fletcher injury law. Really good article in my opinion. It's talking about how people groom others, whether it's a child or an adult. And if a person has been a victim of trauma in some way, they can be re-victimized and re-traumatized. I really hope that a lot of you Scientologists can read between the lines here. No offense to anybody. I'm just saying, I don't want to say names and stuff like that. Filling an emotional void. Perpetrators may target victims who lack strong family or social support systems. By providing empathy, gifts, praise, and quality time, the perpetrator makes the victim feel cared for and fills an emotional need. This gains the victim's trust and loyalty while increasing their dependence on the perpetrator. Like maybe it could possibly be giving a person financial support, food support, help with their rent, making them fill out non-disclosure agreements, meeting physical needs. Alternatively, the perpetrator may provide for the victim financially or offer shelter and food. Wow, just took the words out of my mouth. This generosity obligates. What I talk about obligation yesterday, you guys. Watch this stuff. This generosity obligates the victim to the perpetrator and makes it difficult for the victim to leave the situation. I think a lot of young people, children that are trafficked, go through those kinds of things. The perpetrator uses these physical needs as leverage to demand more from the victim over time. Like the us versus them tactic. Sound familiar? Isolating victim. An important grooming tactic is cutting the victim off from outside support. All cults do that. The perpetrator discourages spending time with others who could detect the abuse. They sow seeds of distrust in these relationships while positioning themselves as the sole source of affection and provision. Isolation amplifies the victim's dependence and makes them more vulnerable to manipulation. I always scream about isolation. I mean, it's so important. In summary, perpetrators systemically groom victims through calculated tactics that build trust, fill needs, and isolate. By understanding these methods, we can better detect abuse, support victims, and prevent victimization. Awareness, education are the first steps toward stopping these heinous crimes. It would behoove LAPD to kind of get in touch with that kind of stuff, wouldn't it? Or maybe some of them are dodging crimes because they're criminals themselves. Isolating the victim, separating from friends and family. What's the word I'm looking for? I can't think of it right now. What Scientology, when they cut you off. Disconnection. To effectively isolate a victim, an abuser must systemically separate them from their support network of friends and family. This is done through various manipulative tactics. They may move the victim to a new location far away from friends and family under the guise of a new job or living opportunity, or the military, or there's so many ways it can do it. This makes the victim dependent on the abuser in their new location. The abuser may also limit the victim's communication with others by controlling their phone, computer, and social media use. Well, Scientology checks the box on all of those. They claim this controlling behavior is out of care and concern. Oh, that's going to be an idea for another video. The fake concern. But effectively cuts the victim off from outside support. I do wonder if homeschooling is a lot of that. I think a lot of people doing homeschooling are good people, but I do think more abusive type folks use the homeschooling so they can isolate their children. An abuser may cultivate distrust and conflict between the victim and their close ones, like their friends or family. They may spread malicious lies and rumors to damage these relationships. Oh, who does that sound like? And make the victim believe that friends and family do not truly care about them. In some cases, an abuser may even forbid the victim from communicating with certain people altogether. They assert that these individuals are bad influences and that the victim must prove their loyalty and obedience by cutting off contact. Through these systemic tactics, an abuser is able to fully isolate the victim from their network of support. The victim becomes completely dependent on the abuser, with no one else to turn to for help. This makes the victim increasingly vulnerable to abuse and unable to escape the situation. By understanding these grooming tactics, we can work to prevent such isolation and protect victims from abuse. Yeah, LAPD, you hear that? Desensitization to inappropriate behavior, normalizing abuse. Wow, that's a big one right there. Scientology totally does it. It's not just Scientology, though. There's a lot of narcissistic abuse, various cults. That's why they're able to continue their behavior. Desensitization to inappropriate behavior, like, for example, Contreras, who did not want to help Becky when her perpetrator followed her. He was guilty of sexual misconduct. I don't even know if should be a felony, what he did. They don't seem to think it's a big deal. The abuser will gradually introduce inappropriate behaviors and interactions to the victim over time to make them seem normal and acceptable. This is done through a slow progression of boundary violations. Boundary violations like what we had the last 3 years that condition the victim to accept the abuse. Touching. At first, an abuser may initiate casual touching like hugs, hair stroking, or shoulder rubs. Over time, the touching becomes more intimate and inappropriate. The victim is made to feel these advances are a normal part of their relationship and interaction. The abuser relies on the victim's trust and previous normalization of contact to introduce increasingly inappropriate touches. Child essay right there. Secrets. An abuser may encourage secret keeping between them and the victim. They convince the victim that certain interactions or details of their relationship must be kept private, like giving them a wedding ring. I'll get into that one day. It's about Michael Jackson. This makes the victim feel complicit in the abuse and less likely to report it. It also furthers the abuser's control and manipulation over the victim. Blaming. If the victim expresses discomfort with inappropriate behaviors, the abuser will blame and shame them. That's exactly what's going on with the AF board. The abuser claims the victim is overreacting or misinterpreting innocent actions. This causes the victim to question their own judgment, gaslighting, and place blame on themselves rather than the abuser. The victim is made to feel shame for speaking up against the abuse. Through these tactics, the abuser is unable to gradually desensitize the victim to abuse by warping their understanding of appropriate and inappropriate behaviors. The victim is manipulated into accepting escalating levels of abuse through a slow process of normalization and conditioning. Recognizing these grooming techniques is key to preventing and intervening in abusive relationships. Maintaining control. What does that sound like when you think about the Scientology children versus the old codgers with all the things that they're doing? Using shame, guilt, and fear. I was just talking about guilting and fear yesterday. To maintain control over the victim, the perpetrator employs tactics such as shame, guilt, and fear. These manipulative techniques are used to keep the victim in a state of confusion and self-doubt, making them easier to exploit. Shame is a feeling of humiliation and distress caused by the perception of wrongdoing or impropriety. The perpetrator will degrade and humiliate the victim by constantly criticizing them and putting them down. This erodes the victim's self-esteem and sense of self-worth, making them feel unlovable and ashamed of who they are. Guilt is a feeling of responsibility or remorse for offenses, real or imagined. The perpetrator will blame the victim for the abuse, claiming that they provoked it or deserved it in some way. Like going out 2D. This misplaced guilt traps the victim in the relationship as they try endlessly to please and appease the perpetrator. Fear is an unpleasant emotion caused by the belief that someone or something is dangerous, likely to cause pain or a threat. LAPD would know all about that, wouldn't they? The perpetrator instills fear in the victim through violence, threats of violence, and intimidation. This fear paralyzes the victim, making them feel powerless to leave the situation. The perpetrator's unpredictable anger also keeps the victim in a constant state of anxiety and dread. Through these manipulative tactics, the perpetrator is able to dominate the victim and maintain ultimate control over them. The victim becomes trapped in a vicious cycle of abuse due to the shame, guilt, and fear instilled in them by their perpetrator. Preventing disclosure, threats, and manipulation. To prevent disclosure of the abuse, perpetrators often threaten and manipulate their victims, just like we saw what happened with Becky. Threats of violence. Abusers frequently threaten to harm the victim or their loved ones if they tell anyone about the abuse. These threats are meant to intimidate the victim into remaining silent. The abuser may threaten violence, incarceration, incarceration, you guys! Where have we seen that one before? Or even death. Sadly, these threats are often effective at preventing the victim from speaking out. Manipulation and gaslighting. Abusers are adept at manipulating their victims to doubt their own perceptions and memories. A common tactic is gaslighting, where the abuser denies that past abusive events occurred or accuses the victim of being crazy. This causes the victim to question their own sanity and reliability. The abuser may also claim that no one will believe the victim if they report the abuse. That's a big one. It would also help if a lot of police officers would actually help victims. And we're not saying all police do this, but it's just ridiculous at this point. And that goes for DAs and all the other people. Isolation. This is so huge right here. Isolation. Perpetrators often isolate their victims from outside support systems. They may restrict access to friends and family or monitor phone and computer use. This makes the victim dependent on the abuser and less likely to disclose the abuse to others. Isolation also means there are fewer opportunities for the abuse to be discovered accidentally. Economic control. Some abusers exert economic control over their victims by restricting their access to money and financial independence. The victim may be unable to leave the relationship due to lack of funds. The abuser can threaten loss of economic support if the victim reports the abuse. This form of control and manipulation further entraps the victim. Victims of abuse often remain silent for years Due to these sinister tactics, yeah, I bet Rinder would know about that one, wouldn't he? Recognizing the signs of threats, manipulation, and control is an important step in preventing ongoing victimization. With support, victims can overcome these obstacles and speak out against their abusers. And this is from Fletcher Law. Hats off to Fletcher Law, doing the good work over here. And I will put the link of the article in the description box. Everyone have a good day or a good night. Peace.